Hello, AP US history students. So this week, I want to talk to you guys about political parties in the age of the Civil War. And this actually is a really important part of American history when it comes to political parties and party development. Up until the time period that we're going to talk about, as you probably remember from class, we had what's called political factions, not political parties. So those were people who were of a common group, had similar types of belief systems, but they really weren't as well organized as a political party would be. And you might remember, too, that I talked about how the Founding Fathers did not want to see us have political parties. Their fear was that if we had political parties, we would get so developed into our party that we'd become loyal to the party, not to the country. That would rip us apart. And of course, we don't see anything like that happening today. Yeah, you can tell the irony in my voice. Anyways, having said that, let's go ahead and jump in to see how these political parties formed in the age of the Civil War. So to start off, we really have to start with the War of 1812. The War of 1812, which we're going to go more into depth on later on in the year and talk about some of the causes, but I want to give you a little bit of context so you kind of know what they were about and why they're important for political parties. The War of 1812 was primarily fought over the Ohio River Valley. Ohio River Valley plays a huge role in early American history. There's kind of an easy reason why. What's in the Ohio River Valley? The Great Lakes. So you can imagine all the incredible resources in that area. You have water for irrigation, you have minerals that are coming off of the Great Lakes, you have incredible farming land, and it's right next to the Mississippi River. And so there just is immense amounts of trade that you can do in this area. American settlers were constantly coming into that area and encroaching into that area. So the British allies at the time, under two major Native Americans, began attacking that American expansion. A man named Tecumseh and the Prophet. They were constantly trying to stop American expansion by organizing the Native American tribes in that region to stop that from happening. So eventually the Americans get into this war, and there's a number of reasons why we choose to do this. One of them does have to do with stopping the Native Americans, as well as seeing the British as really going over their boundaries after the American Revolution and not recognizing American sovereignty in that region. What's important for political party formation is what happens in 1814. So 2 years into the war, the Federalists had opposed going into the War of 1812. They saw it as really just an issue of Democratic Republicans using this war as a way to gain more farming land. So they meet at Hartford in Connecticut and they threaten to secede. Well, only a few months later, Britain decides to pull out of this war, leading to the death of the Federalist faction. So why did they die? Well, everybody sees them as a bunch of traitors. Why did you make this statement that you were going to secede when only a few months later we basically don't beat the British, we stalemate with them, but the British are the strongest empire in the world. So for the Americans to have stalemated with the British really did end up looking like to the Americans as a win. By the way, one other thing that's going to happen is after the treaty was signed, there was a treaty called the Treaty of Ghent. I always love Treaty of Ghent. It sounds very Star Wars-y to me. When the Treaty of Ghent was signed, the Federalists at the time are going to look even worse. Why? Because a couple weeks later, people did not hear that the war was over. And so one more battle took place, even though the war was over. And it happens in New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson is going to defeat the British in a huge battle in which the British are just destroyed in that battle. This really ups the American nationalism at the time. So at that point, the only people who look like you're going to be faithful to are Democratic Republicans. And by the end of the War of 1812, they are the only faction left in the country throughout the 1820s. So in the 1820s, all we have are Democratic Republicans, and then one of them, a man named Henry Clay of Kentucky, develops this idea of an American system in which we will have investments into roads and highways, the primary example being a road called the Cumberland Highway, which connected up all the states. A little side note on that, the Cumberland Road that was developed originally was vetoed by the president because initially it was only about having funding for roads within states. That was not accepted. Once they developed the Cumberland Highway that connected up states, then at that point it was accepted that the American government should do this because it was across states. A national bank to attract investment and tariffs to protect industrial businesses. Sounds eerily familiar. It sounds a lot like Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, but I thought the Federalists were dead. They were dead, but their ideas and their legacy is going to continue and get picked up by politicians of the future. So don't take this as the rise of Federalists, but actually the continuation of federalism. During the 1820s, the president was a man named James Monroe in the early 18 teens and 1820s, and this is known as the Monroe's era of good feelings. Why? Because after the War of 1812, there's a sense of national unity. and economic growth. Now, underneath all this is hiding an underlying real problem, and that's regionalism between the North and the South over the issue of slavery. So that leads into then the 1820s and what's going to happen with the presidency of Andrew Jackson. So in 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought up the Louisiana Territory from the French. The French at the time were really kind of hoping that they would be able to get the Louisiana Territory and then use that as a staging ground to get back the land they lost during the French and Indian War back in the 1740s. This does not happen, and so eventually Napoleon, at the time, who was in charge of France, he has a lot more interest in dealing with Russia. So he sells off the land to Thomas Jefferson and the Americans. Thomas Jefferson sees this as an excellent opportunity for Democratic Republicans because they will now be able to expand into the Midwest and create a huge farming republic, which in essence is what happens. People begin moving out west, and as they move out west, they get property, so that allows them to vote. But remember, these were the guys who couldn't vote when they lived on the East Coast. So once they are able to get the ability to vote based upon their new property, they just say, what's the point of having property requirements anyways? That's what excluded us. So they start dropping those property requirements. Now, this creates a ripple effect throughout the country. If you're a Democratic Republican, which everybody was at the time, you see this as, yeah, this is a great chance to give farmers the ability to vote. If you live up in the Northeast, you're a Democratic Republican, but you also have, remember the American system, you have the legacy of Federalists. You kind of believe in natural aristocracy, but you're never going to win an election again unless you give everybody in your area the right to vote. So they start dropping property requirements as well. This is known as modern democracy. So in 1824, John Quincy Adams is elected over Andrew Jackson. But in that particular election, we actually had like 3 people running for office. And by the time everything was done, it was a tied electoral college result. And so John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson got more popular votes. John Quincy Adams tied Andrew Jackson in the vote. So in order to win this over, Henry Clay was offered a position in John Quincy Adams' cabinet. When people found out about this, because it threw it over, and when you have a tie in the Electoral College, the House of Representatives determines the vote. Henry Clay and his people threw over the last group of votes. This became known as the corrupt bargain, in which John Quincy Adams offered this deal to Henry Clay in order to get him to vote for him, to bring over his followers to him. This angers common farmers to no end. And in 1828, we go just the opposite direction. In 1828, Andrew Jackson just dominates over John Quincy Adams, partially due to modern democracy. All these people out in the Midwest support Jackson, and they have the right to vote now. But also Jackson's persona coming out of that New Orleans battle, in which he's seen as like a great American hero general. And then on top of all that, the corrupt bargain with John Quincy Adams just leads into Andrew Jackson being able to win. So this leads into really the establishment of our first political party, and that's Jacksonian Democrats. Jacksonians believed in strong states' rights. They were virulently against the national bank, and they believed in protecting slave interests. Just to give you an example, Jackson ran off of the idea that the national bank was sort of like an octopus that was out basically conquering the country. And what he eventually did was he just vetoed the national bank. So when the national bank had to be rechartered every 10 years, and when it was brought up for him after this 10-year period, he just vetoed it. He just didn't sign the rechartering. Now, he could have stopped there, and that would have been enough. The bank would have just died on its own. But that's not Jackson's intent. Jackson wants to demonstrate how strong his Jacksonian Democrats are and how much he hates the national bank. So he actually sent the military into the national bank, removing the gold from its vaults to be dispersed out to the states. This is not just destroying the national bank. It is a symbolic action to demonstrate that Jacksonian Democrats were in control. Another example of this. In Georgia, there were a group of Cherokee Indians who were being attacked by farmers in the area because in their area that they lived in, they found gold. These Cherokee Indians really had tried to demonstrate that they were no threat to the Americans. For example, they created their own written constitution. They began wearing clothes that looked like European Americans. They even held their own slaves as a way to demonstrate that they were similar to Southern Americans. Eventually, they had to take their case to court, though, and they took their case to the Supreme Court in 2 different cases. One of those cases was Worcester versus Georgia, in which the Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, sided on the side of the Native Americans, saying that the states had overstepped their boundaries in trying to take away this land. Jackson basically said, yeah, whatever, and sided with the state of Georgia to protect farmers. Now, this is where we lead up to, you probably have heard of the Trail of Tears, where Cherokees are going to be removed in the dead of winter, and about 1/3 of them are going to die as they are marched across into the Mississippi and then eventually into Oklahoma. That did not happen under Andrew Jackson. It happened after his presidency, but Jackson set the groundwork for that to take place. Another one that's kind of strange is what happens in South Carolina. So in order to beat John Quincy Adams, some of the followers of Jackson did something kind of interesting. Remember, his followers are farmers, and they are against tariffs. But they, within the Congress leading up to John Quincy Adams' defeat, they actually did sign in a huge raise in tariffs. Now, why would farmers sign in a raise in tariffs? Well, because they put John Quincy Adams in a horrible position. If John Quincy Adams were to go against this tariff, he would lose support from his followers up in the Northeast who supported tariffs to protect industry. If he decides that he's going to favor the tariff, then he loses all the farmers who are voting. And this is known as the Tariff of Abominations. Well, John Quincy Adams had to sign the tariff into law in order to retain his own industrial base, and so he loses the presidency. Well, the problem is the Tariff of Abominations is now in effect because he signed it into law. And so when Jackson becomes president, he eventually wanted to get rid of the tariff. But South Carolina was so upset about this that it did something called nullification, which was based upon a theory of government raised by Andrew Jackson's vice president, John Calhoun. The idea is known as the compact theory of government. The idea of the compact theory of government is that while we are a federalist country, the states had to give their agreement to that in the Constitution. So that means the states can nullify laws that they don't agree with. This is a theory, okay? And to be quite honest, today in our country, we don't agree with this theory because this would allow states to basically destroy federalism because they could just nullify anything they don't agree with. Jackson, you would think, would support nullification. He's a strong supporter of states' rights, but he doesn't. Jackson actually threatened South Carolina with military power. The only thing that stopped this was Henry Clay going in and brokering a deal with South Carolina. So why would Jackson do this? Well, because Jackson does believe in strong states' rights, but Jackson also believes that he as president has to have a huge amount of power to get done with the things he wants to get done with. And even though South Carolina were basically his supporters, he saw this as a threat to his presidential power and his ability to do what he wanted to do. The reason why all this is important is what happens with a new party that's going to rise. A bunch of leaders up in the Northeast see Jackson as really strengthening the power of the executive branch to an extreme level. And they believe that there has to be a response. And so they form the Whigs as a response to the Jacksonian Democrats. Now, the Whigs really resemble the Federalists. They come from the Northeast. They believe in things like the National Bank, the protective tariff, federal investments to roads and highways. Their political base is in New England, but they did have other people voting for them in other regions. This is where we finally get the two-party political system. Now, from here on out, America will have a two-party political system. It's going to change in who's in the political parties, but this is really the beginning in the 1830s of our two-party political system. So what eventually then does create the two-party system we have today, Republicans and Democrats? Well, in order to understand that, you have to go to slave compromises. So in 1820, the Missouri Compromise, or Compromise of 1820, is going to get passed. Missouri wanted to enter into the country. This would have thrown off the balance between free and slave states. And that becomes important because of the Senate. The Senate, you get 2 representatives per state. If one, North or South, gets more of those representatives, they're going to have more power in the Senate. So in order to keep balance, what they did was they made Missouri a slave state, and they carved Maine out of Connecticut and made that into a free state. So in order then to solve long-term problems, they passed something called the 30-60 parallel, which they believed if you take that 30-60 line, which is about the southern tip of Missouri, and draw it out across the country, anything that comes in above in the north is going to be free, anything below in the south would be slave. Well, this comes into a problem at the Compromise of 1850. At the end of the Mexican-American War, we have a ton of new territories coming into the country, places like California, places like Nevada and New Mexico and Utah. And when you add up all those different states, there would have been an imbalance of the incoming states. Basically, the North would have a 2-state advantage. So in order to get the South to buy into this, the North gave the South a stronger Fugitive Slave Act. South was happy with that, But Massachusetts, which tended to be much more on a radical side at that time period, and by radical what I mean is they opposed immediate abolition of slaves. There were actually a lot of people within Massachusetts who believed in racial equality at that time. And so they were much more on the radical end of the issue of abolition. Well, they responded to what's called personal liberty laws, meaning that they would not participate in returning slaves back to their owners. If somebody was caught in their area and they wanted to return them back to their slave owner, people who lived in Massachusetts simply would give no aid. They would not help to do this. The South saw this and basically believed the North was just conspiratorial. The North was unwilling to compromise. And hadn't the South given in already, why wouldn't the North be willing to compromise? So this is where we start to see then regional breakdowns, and we start to see multiple parties arise because of this. So we had the Whigs, we have the Jacksonian Democrats who have become just the Democratic Party, and then we have a number of other parties. So the Free Soil Party was white people who had moved out into the territories who wanted no slavery there. Now, some did believe in abolition of slavery, but to be quite honest, most simply didn't want to have African Americans move out and become competition for them in that area. So they only wanted white farming in that area. There was also the Know Nothing Party up in the Northeast, which opposed immigrants. They believed new immigrants coming in from Ireland and Germany could never be American because they were Catholic. They gave their allegiance to the Pope and to kings. And then there was a new party called the Republican Party that started in 1854 as a counter both to pro-slave Democrats and what they viewed as being too much compromise from the Whigs on the issue of slavery. Whigs were against slavery, but they saw them as compromising too much in the Missouri Compromise and Compromise of 1850. So what was the Republican position? Well, their position was to keep the country united. And so they believed in stopping the expansion of slavery, but not getting rid of it immediately. Also, they wanted to create a national market. And they were pro-business on tariffs. They wanted tariffs to protect businesses. So you'll notice very similar to the Federalists. So in the election of 1860, the Democrats split their support. They had basically two people on the Democratic side, Stephen Douglas and John Breckinridge, running. And then some people in the South ended up forming a new party called the Constitutional Party under John Bell. They believed in pro-slavery, pro-states' rights, but they wanted to keep the country together. And so John Bell was running to keep people under the Constitution unified. Well, what ended up happening was this creates within elections what's called a plurality of votes, meaning that the South split its votes between three different people. They couldn't get organized under one person. Lincoln then is able to walk in that competition, and Lincoln wins. Now, by the rules of the game, he won. Democrats, though, in the South see this as a trick. And they believe that Lincoln had won because of a trick and because of a, just basically technicality in the rules, that he was going to be a radical abolitionist who would get rid of slavery immediately. So immediately the South begins seceding. And you basically have a number of states who are going to secede from the country at the beginning of the Civil War. Now, again, if you look at the Republican platform at the time, this is all very conspiratorial on the Southern side. The Republicans were very clear about their belief. They wanted to stop the expansion of slavery with the hope that eventually slavery would disappear, but their primary goal was to keep the country united. So during the Civil War, how does this then affect the parties? Well, the Democrats left the Union by seceding, so they no longer afford any competition with the Republicans. And now, if they had won the Civil War, they would have been able to have a country based upon their values. But they don't. And so eventually they have to join up again. But by the time they do, the Republicans basically were able to establish a Federalist agenda during the Civil War. Remember, that's all that's pretty much left up in the North. So they get protective tariffs, a temporary national bank, investments in railroads and the national marketplace, homestead grants for immigrants to move out west. Probably sounds like, wait a second, that helps farmers, right? It does, but by having immigrants move out west, you can now create cities that can connect up with railroads. Lincoln pursued the end of slavery as a moral goal. Initially in 1860, he believes that the Civil War is about uniting the country. By 1863, he believes that God has put him into the position of the presidency to end the immoral practice of slavery. Overall, the effect here by Republicans was to promote industry in a national marketplace. So then we get to the end of the war. In the end of the war, Lincoln was attempting to bring the South back in through a moderate path of ending slavery, but then allowing for racial equality to develop over time. Of course, he's assassinated, and when he is, his vice president becomes president. His vice president was Andrew Johnson, who was actually a Democrat from Tennessee. Lincoln chose him intentionally during the Civil War, during his second administration, in order to try to bring the states together. Andrew Johnson was openly racist. He had no problems making statements very clearly that he was against African Americans and against any attempt to make African Americans racially equal within the country. So a group of Republicans in the Congress called the Radical Republicans led the charge against President Johnson. First, they trapped him into an impeachment case. So they passed a law called the Office of Tenure Act, which said that anybody that Johnson would try to hire or fire in his cabinet had to go through the Radical Republicans and the Republicans in Congress. Well, Johnson saw this as an attack on his power, so he fired a man named Stanton, who was the Secretary of War, who had been a holdover from Lincoln's time period. Stanton was a Radical Republican, fired him, and then Johnson was brought up under impeachment charges. He won the impeachment case in the Senate by 1 vote. That's all that he needed. That was all the Radical Republicans that needed to get rid of him. But even though Andrew Johnson remained president, he was so weakened by impeachment that at that point the Radical Republicans took over. They created military reconstruction of the South, and then they forced the South into accepting the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, 13th Amendment being the end of slavery, 14th being racial equality. If you're born in the country, it does not matter what your race or background is, you are an equal American. And the 15th Amendment being the right to vote for all people regardless of race. So what are the takeaways of this? So first off, post-War of 1812, because we tie with the British, most powerful empire in the world, is a sense of national unity. But underneath all of this is growing sectionalism. That growing sectionalism eventually leads to a two-party system due to the sectionalism and to the Jacksonian presidency. The slave compromises, though, are going to lead to two new parties, the Democrats versus the Republicans. And in the Civil War, because the Democrats leave, the Republican agenda becomes dominant for the national marketplace. The one question we're left with throughout all this, though, is about racial equality within the country. Even though Radical Republicans favored this, as we know, that's going to fall apart. And it's not going to really get implemented until we hit the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s.